Global China, a special issue of Fashion Theory. I'm Jo Turney and I'm chairing this event. Earlier we heard from 5 speakers who offered responses to and issues arising from the special issue, with a focus on themes as broad as globalization through to fashion-centric concerns such as made in China, identity, national identity, and fakes, copies, and shopping online. Each speaker contextualized their stance within the realm of the papers in the special issue. This concluded in a discussion of young Chinese fashion designers and the use of traditional forms and motifs in innovative ways as demonstrated at the current Beijing Olympics. This session started with the global and ended with the local, communicated on a global platform. I anticipate that this session will be equally rich in its responses and to develop the discussion in new and exciting ways. Just as a reminder, please keep your cameras and microphones off unless you're speaking. This is really important because otherwise it will be very difficult for us to maintain any kind of technological coherence. Speakers, you have between 7 and 9 minutes to present your work, and also if anybody has any questions for speakers or any questions that just arise as listening to things that people have said or anything you want to say, would you please put that in the chat for us, and I will be very happy to share those comments and questions to speakers as we go on throughout the session and right at the end as well. Mariana is with us today, who is going to be moderating and dealing with any kind of technological glitches. So thank you so much, Mariana, for doing that. As before, we will have people responding to, or we have speakers responding to the issues that they are interested in within the articles in Fashion Theory. And today, again, we have with us the editors of this journal, Professors Wesley Ling and Simona Sigua-Renac, who will be here to join in with this session. We also have with us an author from this, whose paper appears in this journal, I'm so sorry, Professor Sean Metzker. Professor Sean Metzker is a professor at the School of Theatre, Film and Television at the University College of Los Angeles. He works in the intersections of several fields: visual performance, visual culture, art, fashion, film and theatre, as well as Asian American, Caribbean, Chinese film, performance and sexuality studies. His monographs include Chinese looks, fashion, performance, race, and the Chinese Atlantic, seascapes and the theatricality of globalization. Thank you very much for being here, Sean. As before, we will have speakers who will respond to these articles. Everybody will be asked to join alphabetically, and I'll introduce people as they turn up. Before we start, though, I'd like to pass the floor over to one of the editors of this volume, Professor Wesley Ling. Thank you, Wesley.
Thank you, Jo, for this introduction. That is absolutely marvelous. I am very shortly going to hand the floor to all our guest speakers, but before that, I would very much like to thank all the guest speakers for joining us today and also doing all the work preparing for the launch and reading the articles. So it's really, we're in huge debt to your favour and contribution today. And we also like to thank the University of Southampton, Winchester School of Art, for co-organising this event with us, and especially to Jo, who chair this session and also liaise with all these speakers and nitty-grittiness for the event. We'd also have University of Bologna, who's also supporting this event through communications, and that was really grateful to have them on board. And certainly Creature is always our platform to host research seminars, and we're very grateful that our research centre is hosting this fantastic event. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the ball back to Jo for the speaker.
Thank you very much, Wesley. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Hazel Clark, who is the Professor of Design Studies and Fashion Studies in the School of Art, Design and Theory at Parsons New School. The scholarship is focused on uncovering new perspectives, cultures, and geographies for the study of fashion and design in Europe and in the United States and China. Her scholarly books and co-editions include The Shang-Sun, Old Clothes, New Looks, Secondhand Fashion, the Fabric of Cultures, Fashion Identity, Fashion and Everyday Life, Britain and America, and Fashion Curating in the Museum and Beyond, among many, many others. Welcome, Hazel.
Thanks for the introduction, Jo, and good afternoon, everyone from New York. I'm from New York. Good afternoon, wherever you are. So also a big thank you to Wesley and to Simona for speaking, for inviting me to speak at this event and for hosting this event. And many congratulations also to everyone involved on this exciting special issue of Fashion Theory. I'm actually going to respond to Wesley's article, which I found was very thought-provoking. Its title is Conceptualizing Made in China for a Museum Exhibition, an exhibition which is actually going to be held next year in Rotterdam. I was interested to learn about the exhibition and the questions it raised because as a fashion and fashion studies discourse has developed over the last 20 plus years, it has, in my view, benefited as a critical practice from the contribution of exhibitions held in different parts of the world. But as with conceptualizing Made in China, conceptualizing an exhibition which includes fashion is complicated. It's not only a scholarly endeavor, but one which must acknowledge how each visitor will bring their own understanding to what they see. So it was intriguing to consider how the cliché Made in China can effectively serve as the provocation for an exhibition of artifacts which will include fashion and will address China, as Wesley states, as a place, heritage, and concept. In considering this, my mind was drawn to another exhibition, China Through the Looking Glass, which was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2015. It was and remains one of the Met's most successful shows, certainly in terms of visitor numbers, attracting over 800,000 people from around the world, including many visitors from mainland China. And while it wasn't the first exhibition of its type in New York, China Through the Looking Glass was undoubtedly the largest and the most spectacular to address China's fashion and dress, seen from the perspective of its influence on Western fashion and fashion designers. This was facilitated in an ambitious curatorial venture which was innovative in displaying fashion in the museum's permanent Asian galleries, alongside collections of decorative arts, porcelain lacquer, sculpture, painting, furniture, as well as in the Costume Institute galleries themselves, where historic garments and contemporary pieces formed a part of a remarkable multimedia presentation, which included black mirrors, circular vitrines, and film clips projected on large screens to include the likes of Bertolucci's The Last Emperor, which were selected by Hong Kong filmmaker Wong Kar-wai. The inclusion of cinema enhanced the sensory experience for the audience for an exhibition which intentionally presented an imaginary of China. As the exhibition curator Andrew Bolton wrote, quote, like Alice's made-believe world, the China reflected in the examples of haute couture and avant-garde ready-to-wear fashions are a fictional, fabulous invention, offering an alternative reality with a dream-like logic, unquote. Bolton acknowledged how chinoiserie and Edward Said's Orientalism had conceptually framed the show, a choice which, needless to say, brought more than a little criticism. But it was a choice that provided a rationale for garments to be placed and effectively to find their place on a par with the Met's significant collection of Asian art and artifacts. Memorably, designer wore Pei's lotus dress that appeared to have been spun from gold thread, which was placed adjacent to the Met's famous large-scale Buddhist sculptures. This exhibition raised wider questions, both intriguing and taxing, which Wesley's article also addresses, of how to exhibit fashion and dress from China in ways that are relevant and respectful today, in order that visitors might engage with multiple Chinas and interpretations of Chineseness. And also, it raised the question of what to call such exhibitions. Wesley discusses Made in China as the proposed Rotterdam exhibition title as a provocation, one which raises questions about the geopolitical and cultural boundaries of China. Wesley cautions that Made in China can be both a rallying cry for nation building and at the same time, to a different contingency of people, stigmatized on the basis of China's human rights and ethical practices. She also reminds us how recent relationships between China mainland and Taiwan and Hong Kong have, in her words, created a rupture with the notion of Chinese identity, particularly for Chinese outside of the PRC. This statement brought to my mind also a venture that was started in the early 1990s in Hong Kong by entrepreneur David Tang. His emporium Shanghai Tang started just before the 1997 handover. The concept was to revive and honor both the aesthetics and tailoring skills which existed in 1930 Shanghai. But interestingly, the brand label bore the words "made by Chinese" rather than the more familiar "made in China," to highlight the ethnicity of the makers rather than the nation state. With this example in mind, for the forthcoming exhibition, I was seduced by the possible title, "Making China," which Wesley also mentions in her article. Making is an active term. We, as humans, make our artifacts, and they in turn make us back. Nowhere more than with our garments, which when worn on the body and in different social and cultural contexts, produce their own sets of meanings. Making China also feels like an interesting provocation to represent how China is a work in progress, one which will be articulated by this exhibition's curators and then reinterpreted in the responses of its visitors, critics, and reviewers. As a critical space, but also as a work of the imagination, the exhibition is a form which has the flexibility to present and question different notions of Chineseness. Ones, to paraphrase Wesley, that are neither definite nor fixed, that are dynamic and differentiated in context, time, and place. I look forward with curiosity to seeing the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hazel. That was incredibly thought-provoking to carry on the idea of provocation. Thank you. I hope there are a lot of questions that will be raised in relation to that. I would like to introduce now our second speaker, Professor Jonathan Fez, who's Professor of Fashion Thinking at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton. His research examines the interface between popular culture, textiles and dress. He launched Luxury, History and Culture and Consumption, the first peer-reviewed academic journal into this globally contested term. He has published widely, including the critically acclaimed work Tartan and more recently Fur, A Sensitive History, published by Yale University Press. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jo, for that introduction. And also, I'd like to thank Wesley and Simona and Fashion Theory for inviting me to speak today. My talk is in response to Sean Metzker's elegant and thought-provoking paper, Vampiric Fashion, Chinese Circulation, Cinema and Clothing on Screen and Off. I say response, but what I'm about to present is more accurately a set of parallels and echoes that occurred to me as I read the paper. Like Sean, I too am going to focus on a particular garment, this one I hope you can see here, but unlike Sean, the garment in question is not a film costume, but rather an example of early 20th century fashion, not worn on screen, but with many of the performative aspects, nevertheless, that the word costume implies. The garment in question is this magnificent ermine coat designed by Madeleine Vionnet in 1935 for Anna May Wong, arguably Hollywood's first Asian American star. Anna May Wong, born Wong Lu Xiong in Los Angeles to second-generation Chinese parents in 1905, is chiefly remembered today for her roles in Shanghai Express, directed by Joseph von Sternberg in 1932, starring alongside Marlene Dietrich, and in the 1929 British production Piccadilly, made by E.A. Dupont, appearing as the cabaret dancer Shosho, which resulted in Wong achieving instantaneous celebrity status in the UK. As Sean has taken the actor Maggie Chong's latex bodysuit, worn in the 1996 film Irma Vep, to consider how Chineseness circulates transnationally in relation to clothing, and how the figure of the vampire and notions of vampirism explored in the film function, if you like, extra-diegetically and facilitate a discussion of the significance of latex and indeed silk, the material from which Irma Vep's costume in the original 1915-16 film series Les Vampires was made, I will take Wong's ermine coat here to understand how fashion was used by Wong as a means to interrogate the dominant construction of Chineseness promoted within the Hollywood system of the 1920s and 30s, and to consider the symbiotic relationship between the fur and early film industries. Similarly, I'll try and utilize another supernatural figure, that of the werewolf, or more accurately, the she-wolf, to both reflect and think through the specific strategies adopted by Wong to challenge the prevailing climate of xenophobia in Hollywood's so-called golden era. Throughout her career, Anna May Wong battled against both the typecasting, from which the few Chinese film actors of the period all suffered, which typically consigned Wong to playing either one of two prevailing cinematic Chinese female stereotypes, either that of the Dragon Lady, typically constructed as a scheming, deceitful, strong, and often sexually predatory figure, where otherness was signified by Chinese traditional dress, read through a Western exoticizing lens, or the other stereotype, that of the butterfly, as it's been called, an impossibly fragile and demure figure, ultimately too delicate to survive the narratives into which this unchallenging and pitiable construction of the Chinese woman was inserted. Wong, tiring of the restricting miscegenation that infected Hollywood during this period, which meant that Wong as a Chinese actor was forbidden to appear in roles with white actors where there might be a suggestion of an interracial relationship, and which also meant that she was overlooked in favour of white actresses performing in what has been termed yellowface, she left for Europe in 1928, where, to a degree at least, she found greater acceptance. If Wong's typical on-screen wardrobe of Hollywood versions of Xiongsan's or exotic dancing costumes had little power to challenge the stereotypes she was forced to play, unlike Irma Vep's confrontational silk or latex bodysuits, her appearance off-screen made full use of the power and indeed global currency of fashion. Wong, realizing the power of fashion, its popular appeal, and potential for transgression early in her career, constructed her public off-screen persona as a fashion icon, and was widely regarded as one of the most fashionable stars of the era, the personification of the celebrity flapper, with her distinctive short bobbed hair and patronage of many of the most celebrated couturiers of the day, including Madeleine Vionnet, the designer of her ermine coat. Wong's press-worthy glamorous image meant that while she may have been restricted on screen, her popular appeal and fame as a fashion icon provided for her a public platform from which she could be outspoken regarding not only the treatment of Chinese actors in Hollywood, but a number of other political issues which she espoused, including her outspokenness against the increasing imperial Japanese threat to China at the time. The tropes of infection and contamination that vampirism has been understood to symbolize, and which are skillfully transposed in Sean's essay to provide a reading of the significance of a Chinese actor, Maggie Chong, supplanting the French Musidora of the original series, also facilitates a discussion of the substitution of latex for silk and possible ideas of the ever-present threat of infection, signalled here by the leaky latex suit, which is in need of constant repair, lest the contaminating Chinese body within is allowed to escape. The idea of infection and the figure of the vampire that we see first formulated by criminologists and literary historians such as Daniel Pick, and his idea of the fear of contamination and degenerescence, as he termed it, of late 19th century society, by the figure of the other, expressed by the emergence of the figure of the vampire, has a literary counterpoint in the figure of the werewolf. The werewolf is a figure caught in a state of constant hybridity, a border figure between the human and inhuman, shape-shifting and restless, who abandons human clothing to reveal the wolf beneath the skin. They are taboo figures that meander across the hinterland between good and evil, between cultivated and bestial, and here I might suggest between the Chinese and Western body. Wong's ermine coat plays, as do all fur garments, with fantasies of the bestial, the assumption of the traits of the animal whose skin is now translated into fashion, and simultaneously with our own fears of the primeval, expressed by our ambivalence to our own bodily hair. Wong's fur is ermine, however, a fur that has its own rich symbolism, and which in this most fashionable of guises speaks of defilement and purity, nobility, suffering, and the possibility of transgression. Not a wolf in sheep's clothing, but perhaps a Chinese wolf in Western ermine's disguise. Ermine is the most expressive of luxury and nobility, its importance reflected in its continued incorporation into surviving ceremonial dress. Ermine is the name given to the stoat or weasel in its winter coat. The summer coat of the stoat changes from sandy brown on the back and head with a white belly to solid white, except for the characteristic black tipped tail. Due to the whiteness of the ermine's coat, it became symbolic of purity, and we can trace it back to many 17th century texts where we read mottos referring to the ermine preferring death to defilement. Now, whether the veracity of this animal behavior can be actually proved or not is beside the point, but the idea of ermine becoming associated with purity, and thus by extension virginity, became fixed in kind of Western popular imagination. So for her coat, Wong chose ermine, understood as the most changeable of furs and traditionally providing its wearers with a cloak of innocence. A similar cloak of distracting white innocence is worn by the central character, the female werewolf named White Fell, in Clemence Hausmann's The Werewolf, published in 1896, a year before Bram Stoker's more widely known Dracula, but which is another example of the literary expression of late 19th century fears of contamination and infection, and in Hausmann's novels specifically, fin de siècle fears of the changing role of women in society. The White Wolf here read as a critique of the new woman, a role that finds its echo some 25 years later in Wong's attempt to establish a new global female media subject, an actor that fought against Western models of China using the currency of emerging global fashion. So given this, can we understand Wong's ermine coat as simultaneously a sartorial demonstration of social deviance, Western xenophobia, and a fashionable camouflage? Wong uses this most fashionable of garments to construct a stylish carapace under which she could attempt to gain ascendancy, to advocate the dismantling of Hollywood's construction of Chineseness, and utilize the popular appeal of fashion as a form of stylish lycanthropy, where seductive surfaces provide glimpses of more complex interiors. This last most strikingly revealed by the coat's silken lining, which turns back, you can see here, to reveal embroidered Chinese characters proclaiming Wong's real rather than stage name, Wong Yusheng. So just as both silk and latex provide a textile conduit with which to understand industrial colonialism and global developments in Sean's essay, fur also has a direct relevance to globalism and indeed the global dissemination of fashion. In a climate where fashionable fur is increasingly under threat in the West, the fur industry has found new markets and indeed producers of fur elsewhere, most notably China, the world's largest consumer of fur and largest body of consumers. And those luxury brands who still use fur now concentrate on targeting Chinese consumers. Historically, however, fur and Hollywood have an under-researched symbiosis, as many of Hollywood's pioneers used the fortunes they had generated for their involvement in the fur industry to finance the new business of cinema at the beginning of the 20th century. Most notably Adolf Zukor, who used the fortune he made from his novelty fur company to found Paramount Pictures, and returning to Wong's coat here, and as an aside, whilst it was designed by V&A, it was actually made by the prominent New York furriers H. Jekyll and Sons, whose son Richard Jekyll would go on to have one of Hollywood's most illustrious careers as a character actor. So to conclude, fur looked good on screen, especially white furs such as ermine on black and white film, and for much of the 20th century, Hollywood's promotion of fashionable fur meant that the two industries maintained a fashionable partnership of symbiotic promotion, disseminating an idealized fashionable image, in this case of fur, around the globe. Whether Anna May Wong felt that her ermine coat went in some part to establishing her acceptance as an actor rather than a Chinese actor is unknown, but perhaps its evocations of the figure of the white wolf, forever negotiating the borders of subjectivity and objectivity, made it a suitably fashionable camouflage for Wong, who once said, "It's a pretty sad situation to be rejected by Chinese because I'm too American, and by American producers because they prefer other races to act Chinese parts." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was amazing. I hope that we can talk about this a little more, and perhaps John would like to respond to this maybe at the end in the Q&A session. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Let us now move on to our next speaker, who is Elio Howe. Elio Howe is currently a third-year PhD student in design at Winchester School of Art, the University of Southampton. His research title is An Intersectional Analysis of Queer Men in Social Issue-Driven Fashion Films. His research is focused on the representation of queer men and gendered representation in contemporary fashion films, with specific focus on the engagement within fashion films with queer-related social issues. He is a visiting lecturer at the MA Fashion Management and is also an artist who specialises in mythology, yokai and surrealism. Welcome, Elio. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jo, for the lovely introduction, and hello everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'm really glad that actually Professor Jonathan was talking about the Chineseness, because my concern and my presentation is going to also relate to that, but from another different perspective. I'm going to respond to Dr. Xingu and Ming Lu's paper, Renegotiating National Identity Through Chinese Fashion. So it's very interesting to see in this paper that Dr. Xingu and Ming Lu has introduced various methods and of how contemporary fashion designers, especially Chinese fashion designers and fashion entrepreneurs, practice, utilize, and interpret or reinterpret Chineseness with our cultural signifiers or the heritage in regards to specifically sustainability in the fashion industry. But when I was reading this paper, I had this question: what exactly does Chineseness mean today? Not just for from the commercial perspective, but for everyone. Because, or I shall ask, who constructed it and who is constructing it and for whom? Because if you think about it, actually every culture is working in the same manner. Individual can experience their culture differently. So, which means 100 Chinese, they may construct this kind of sensitivity of Chineseness differently. So one example here might be helpful to explain, and although it's not directly from the fashion industry, however, it's related somehow. So I believe many of you are, especially for Chinese, I believe you're familiar with the Chinese snack retailer Three Squirrels, and they were in trouble last December because one commercial photography from 2019 was dug out and accused by some netizens that it is a demonization of Chinese because the squint eye and thick lips of the model. And it was initially and probably still be used as a stereotypical look from the Western countries, not just the fashion industry, to represent or construct Chinese and Chineseness, such as the Dior's photography in response to magazine ID's proud retention theme. It was also questioned to vilify Asian women, not just Chinese, because it adopted a squinting look. However, I'm not going to discuss whether this brand is innocent or not, but it's different considering it's a Chinese company and featuring a Chinese model who has afterwards stood out to ask, this is what I look like. Don't I have a right to be a Chinese now because my small eyes? So it appears to be a controversial idea as a beauty or aesthetic, but it is also about an ideal which is formed, an ideal of Chineseness produced or can be produced by both Chinese themselves and also the others. And the new Oh, hang on. So it really implies that for certain part of Chinese, and it is not, definitely not a small amount of people, because it was very, I should say popular, but it's not really the word. It's too positive to say popular. A topic on Weibo, I believe. And so now we kind of have to question, are we forming another stereotype from another? Are we reform a stereotype for ourselves? So which can be very dangerous, because initially we dislike the stereotypical Western constructed Chinese look or Chineseness. That's partially because we dislike the fact that they completely ignored the diversified Chineseness and our culture and how do we look, right? But by rejecting it, rejecting the look, it's also marginalize a certain group of people and even some subcultures. So I think it's really dangerous because it's leading us to a fixed pattern with limited diversity of Chineseness. So come back to the paper. I think one question is that was to be considered in the future in the process of creativity, practicing or reinterpreting traditional Chinese craftsmanship, culture signifiers, etc. Whatever we use to construct this kind of idea of Chineseness, and is there any potential risks that the Chineseness could be patterned? And of course, from this paper's perspective, I assume partially these designers, entrepreneurs, they have to respond to the market. They have to respond to the dominant aesthetic and their consumers. But is it a right thing to do? And how do we avoid, or probably we should never, I mean, we can never avoid it. It's impossible. But we have to know that the ideal is never an ideal, but a stereotype. And we really don't want to marginalize anyone, any individual or community or culture. So yeah, and also I think it's very interesting, interestingly connected with Professor Anthony's work, because they are actually both about an exotic culture in another country and being interpreted and reinterpreted. But in Professor Anthony's work, it's largely misinterpreted. So yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elio. That was very thought-provoking. I think you're raising some very interesting issues there that have come up earlier in the series, these programs as well. And hopefully we'll be able to discuss these a little bit more in the question and answer session. Thank you very much. I'd like now to introduce Willemijn van der Noor, who I hope is here, Dr. Willemijn van der Noor, who is a curator for the Chinese collections at the National Museum van Wereldculturen in the Netherlands. Her main research interests are Chinese art and material culture within global history, the role of material culture in representations, and the perceptions of China and histories of collecting and display. She is currently working on an exhibition about China for the Werewolf Museum in Rotterdam for 2023. I believe that your name is spelled incorrectly, so we need to add an extra D at the end of Van Noord. Okay, thank you very much and welcome, Willemijn.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I hope you can see and hear me. And just a small correction, I know it's printed in the article that the exhibition is supposed to open next year, but fortunately we still have over 2 years to prepare, so some time that we definitely need. So I'm the curator of Chinese collections at the Dutch National Museum of World Cultures and Wereld Museum in Rotterdam, where we are working on this exhibition tentatively titled Made in China. planned to open in 2024. And this exhibition concept arose from the desire to showcase the existing largely historical Chinese collections in relation to current issues, whilst also giving an impulse to acquiring contemporary works for the collection. And we therefore came up with this idea to organize an exhibition around the concept made in China. There have been many museums employing this phrase as a title for an exhibition, usually displaying historical Chinese artifacts. For example, the exhibition Made in China: Porcelain, which is currently on display at the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg, Germany, which showcases Chinese porcelain from the Ming and Qing dynasties. Presumably, such exhibitions use this well-known phrase in their title as a marketing tool to attract visitors. However, the content of such exhibitions usually does not address the multiple connotations of the phrase made in China. And this is exactly what we hope to do in our exhibition, to explode this term, as it were, dissecting how different aspects of making, from craftsmanship throughout Chinese history to mass production in the PRC today, are related to individual and national self-fashioning, and also how such made objects can impact on imaginaries of China. We will explore such relations through various types of objects, including fashion, approaching them through the themes of making, copying, and creating. The exhibition aims to invite visitors to examine and critically reflect on how certain aspects of making, such as creativity, originality, but also mass production and faking, tradition versus innovation, craftsmanship versus efficiency, may be valued differently in China and abroad, and have become associated with stereotypical views of China. And number two, it challenges, the idea is to challenge the idea of China as the home of one homogeneous culture. That may be an obvious point to most of the people in the audience today, but it's an odd idea that many of museum visitors might have. So last June, we organized a workshop with our Research Center for Material Culture to analyze the multiple connotations of this contested phrase and how we could conceptualize made in China and reinvest it with value for our visitors. And Wessie Ling was one of the keynote speakers invited for this workshop, and this led her to write this article, Conceptualizing Made in China for a Museum Exhibition. In her article, Ling analyzes the phrase made in China and China as a place, heritage, and concept. There are three main points important for the curatorial direction of the exhibition that I would like to discuss here. The first concerns the country of origin effect of the made in label. This effect is the bias that consumers hold against the country of origin of the product, whereby consumers connect a product with the country of origin to form an image of that country, and whereby the image of that country affects the product's image as well. In the case of China, these images are related to questionable reliability, safety, ethical records, and international credibility. Even though in recent decades, China-made clothes have mastered skill and quality with Italian-made machinery, technology, and know-how, this mastery had not been effectively translated into the perceived value of China's products, meaning the Made in China label continues to be associated with poor quality and cheaply manufactured products. Through comparison with the Made in Italy label, Ling points out the differences in marketing strategies and the impact thereof. Made in Italy has become a synonym of luxury, quality, and craftsmanship through the rhetoric of entrepreneurs and marketing experts, coupled with a conscious branding strategy. By contrast, the People's Republic takes top-down state initiatives such as Made in China 2025, which so far has not succeeded in cultivating an enticing global image for the Made in China label. Another important point that Ling makes is the fact that the Made in label only reveals the last section of the global production chain, omitting many countries that supply components. Through their assembly in the People's Republic, essentially global products are labeled as Chinese. So in the exhibition, we need to communicate this to the visitor, whilst also addressing how China came to be this place of assembly, and how we as local consumers are implicated in this development. In regard to this development, Ling illuminates the transnational and transcultural exchanges, particularly with Hong Kong and Taiwan, that are at the foundation of contemporary China and its becoming of a global powerhouse in clothing and textile manufacturing. Namely, it was Taiwanese and Hong Kong travelers that entered mainland China from the 1980s that taught the Chinese much about contemporary lifestyle and consumer culture, eventually transforming Chinese culture at creative practices at a local level. The know-how of Hong Kong manufacturing investors who transplanted their factories to the mainland enabled the growth of the fashion business in the mainland. In the exhibition, we need to expose those transcultural facets of the Chineseness in the Made in China label. As for this Chineseness, the third important point that Ling puts forward is that of the unclarity of Chinese identity. With opposing national images of China, most importantly by the People's Republic and the United States, the notion of Chinese identity has become ruptured, particularly for the Chinese outside the PRC. This has led those with Chinese descent to simultaneously mobilize and disavow their Chinese identity. How then can China be understood, let alone be displayed in an exhibition, if Chinese identity is unclear? During the workshop, it was suggested that we avoid presenting Chinese artifacts as the end product of Chinese culture and heritage, but rather consider them as a process of changes and an ever-evolving agent that might draw connections with and transformation from China. In the article, Ling presents two objects from the museum collection to exemplify how this could work. The first being a 1930s qipao dress tailor-made in Shanghai, owned and worn by an Indonesian Chinese woman in Indonesia and the Netherlands after having moved there. The dress had been worn on occasions when the mother wanted to invoke a sense of Chineseness, emphasizing her Chinese identity in Indonesia and the Netherlands. The second example is a set of artifacts, including t-shirts, designed by Hong Kong designer Kit Ban, bearing Cantonese slogans in a typeset he created to preserve traditional Chinese characters and the Cantonese language used in Hong Kong that is under pressure of being replaced by Mandarin. As such, Kit Man's designs tell a bottom-up story of a local experience of being Chinese. An experience that is contested and expressed through the connections and differences between China as a polity and regime on the one hand, and China as a place, race, and civilization on the other. In her article, Ling has underlined the necessity of embracing and showing the multiplicities behind the facade of the Made in China label. At the museum, we are currently in the process of translating some of these abstract notions into intelligible displays, for example, by using object biographies to communicate the heterogeneous voices and positionalities of being Chinese in a way that is accessible to the average visitor. You're very much invited to be part of this process by giving us your feedback, and to come and view the results when the exhibition opens at the Wereldmuseum in Rotterdam in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really exciting and interesting. I'm very much looking forward to the exhibition. Shame it's not next year, but never mind, it gives you more time to prepare. Thank you so much. It was really good to hear how the exhibition is coming along and the kind of key issues that were raised in its construction. Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Elio Howe, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Louisville. His research clusters around two subject areas, the Chinese fashion industry and Chinese family businesses. He is the author of The Chinese Fashion Industry, an Ethnographic Approach. I welcome you very much. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, hello. Hello.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. I couldn't see myself. Thank you, Jill, for the introduction, and thank you, Wesley, for inviting me to speak here. First, I'd like to congratulate all the contributors to this special issue of Fashion Theory for launching another piece of groundbreaking scholarship. For too long, fashion has been a Western-centered discourse, and people in developing countries such as China are sometimes referred to as the people without fashion, borrowing from anthropologist Eric Wolf's classic treatise, Europe and the People Without History. This special issue zeroes in on China and its multifaceted global connections to fashion and the fashion industry. We have heard many insightful comments on many articles so far. I would like to limit my comments on two articles in this special issue, specifically Liang Xu's Chinese investment and the rise of Made in Africa fashion production, and Simona Sagre-Reinach's from joint ventures to collaborative projects toward an ethnography in Sino-Italian fashion relations in the 2020s. Both articles examine emerging new trends in China's roles in the global production of fashion. China has been considered the factory of the world when it comes to fashion, which is still true in many ways. But as these two articles have demonstrated, that this overarching stereotypical view can longer capture the entirety and complexity of the Chinese fashion industry and misses some new and rapidly developing trends. In Xu's article, we see a growing trend of investments by Chinese entrepreneurs churning out made in Africa garments. In Sagre-Reinach's article, we see the Chinese partners becoming increasingly more assertive and more, in some cases, becoming more than equal partners in Sino-Italian fashion joint ventures and collaborative projects owing to their access to the Chinese market or financial might, raising interesting questions about both made in China and made in Italy. While the two articles have examined emerging new trends of the global reach of Chinese fashion manufacturing and creation, they also point to many opportunities for further exploration. In Xu's article, the focus is on how Chinese-owned garment factories in Newcastle, South Africa, are related to two age-old phenomena in the garment industry, namely outsourcing/race to the bottom and gender politics. The former refers to capital chasing the lowest cost of production by constantly relocating manufacturing capacity from higher cost areas to low labor cost areas. The latter refers to the high concentration of female labor in the garment industry and its social and political implications. On the former, Xu notes that all Chinese garment companies in Newcastle are small family-based firms manufacturing basic clothing for South Africa's domestic buyers, which are different from the high-end firms in Cape Town. Such a description does not exactly say anything about whether or not those Chinese firms were in a constant race to the bottom. While Xu clearly frames these Chinese firms as relocation from China to Africa, the data presented in the article does not seem to support such a claim. As Xu notes in the article that the owners of these garment companies were former managers of Hong Kong and Taiwan firms, and they became independent entrepreneurs buying the equipment on the cheap after the Taiwan and Hong Kong firms left South Africa. They appear not to be connected to any mainland Chinese capital, manufacturing capacities, or market. That being said, there are Chinese firms expanding and relocating out of China due to increasing costs, particularly to Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. It will be worthwhile to assess the extent to which those Chinese firms in Newcastle represent a genuine relocation of production from China to Africa, and how they differ from or similar to relocated and or outsourced Chinese firms in Southeast Asia. On the issue of gender politics, Xu points out the stark contrast between female labor force in garment factories in Newcastle and those in China. While in China, garment factories are usually staffed by young single women, garment workers in Newcastle are usually single mothers. In fact, both groups of female labor are fairly common in the garment industry, and they are both vulnerable in their own ways. For example, Jane Collins finds that unmarried single mothers tend to be the main workforce in garment factories in rural Mexico. It will be fascinating to conduct more in-depth research and find out how Chinese capitalism touches down in South Africa, how Chinese capital and management negotiate with the local politics and culture, and how the ways in which female labor resists and is disciplined vary in the two countries of China and South Africa. In an article From Joint Ventures to Collaborative Projects, Sergei Rinach examines different types of Sino-Italian fashion relations, ranging from joint ventures in the 1990s to various forms of collaborative projects today. Based on her decades-long research with Italian fashion professionals, Sergei Rinach chronicled a drastic change from Sino-Italian joint ventures that was dominated by the Italians who controlled the creation of fashion to a Sino-Italian relation in which the Chinese are controlling high-end Italian brands, employing Italian fashion professionals as consultants and designers, owing to their growing financial might. It is interesting that Sergei Rinach refers to the fashion produced by the joint ventures as made in Italy, containing the essence of Italietta and cosmopolitanism. And fashion resulted from the second type of relationship as co-creation, which unsettles existing notions of authorship and made in. However, perhaps because of limited space of the article, Sergei Rinach did not elaborate on any of those concepts or how the concepts materialize in joint ventures or collaborative projects. As an anthropologist, I'm eager to learn more ethnographic details illustrating how Italietta and cosmopolitanism were created and marketed by the joint ventures and today's collaborative projects. In what ways are the fashion created by the collaborative projects co-creations? How has this new relationship reshaped the concept of authorship and made in? How is this Sino-Italian relationship different from French conglomerates acquiring Italian brands or French haute couture houses hiring other nationals, say Americans, as designers? In other words, is Chinese capital changing the game of the global fashion industry? If so, in what ways? Much of the author's comments on the Chinese fashion industry and Chinese fashion firms are based on indirect data gathered through interviews with Italian fashion professionals. And there are no perspectives for the Chinese in this Sino-Italian fashion relation. This begs the question, what are the roles of Chinese fashion professionals in this relationship? What are the goals and strategies of Chinese fashion professionals and fashion firms to go global? How do the Chinese map their vision and value onto fashion products they co-created with Italian fashion professionals? To conclude, both articles touch upon fascinating new developments in China's global reach in fashion production and creation. I'm looking forward to reading more from both authors. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was incredibly insightful. I think you've pointed out some really amazing opportunities for more research into this area, and have drawn attention to some very interesting points there. Thank you so much. Really great questions. Okay, so we've now reached the end of this this event, really. Thank you, everybody who's spoken. I'm just wondering if we have any questions for the floor, or if we have any questions for perhaps the authors, or for Wessie or Simona. And does anybody have anything they would like to add? Okay, well, while I'm waiting for you all to get all of your ideas in order and to raise some questions, I think that for me, I've been paying some attention, obviously, throughout this session. What has been really exciting has been to hear everybody talking about issues to do with provocation, and how the authors, but also the respondents, have been addressing issues to do with challenging expectation and understanding of what China might be, what China is, how China responds to fashion, how fashion responds to China, notions of identity and identities, but particularly a key term that has continually come up and is obviously very much part of Wessie and Simona's understanding of this, is the notion of multiples, the idea of multiple China and Chinas, the notion of multiple ideas of what Chineseness is, and the Chinese, if indeed we can talk about the Chinese in any kind of way. The idea of multiplicity and multiple meanings, approaches and interpretations. We've seen that certainly developed or addressed within Jonathan's paper, within Hazel's paper, but also in, well, in fact, all of the arguments, and particularly in Williamen's talk about the exhibition that she is currently staging. I think also what we've also found out is that this idea, or have kind of concentrated on this idea, is not the object but the process. The idea that things are continually being invented and reinvented. The idea that something is physical does not mean that it's static. And I think that certainly was highlighted in Jonathan's talk about the Anna Wong's fur coat. So thank you, everybody. If anybody has some questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. And in the interim, I'd like to hand over to Wessie to say a few concluding words, if that's okay, Wessie.
Thank you so much, Jo, for this summary. This is brilliant. And thank you very much for all the guest speakers. And I know that Sean might want to respond to Jonathan. I think Jonathan was raising something in the comment of the paper. Before we draw a close, I just want to invite Sean to see whether he wants to say a few words with Jonathan's provocation.
Sure. Let me pull my video up. First of all, I want to say thank you to Wessie and Simona for putting this issue together, and to all the contributors. I was quite taken with Jonathan's analysis, and I really have less a response than kind of questions that further the dialogue. In particular, I was interested in historiographically in the fur trade and what that means. I mean, Anna May Wong is an interesting figure because she built herself as a cosmopolitan in the middle of the Great Depression, which I think is an interesting move to make, and the implications for how racialized subjects navigate that moment in history through industries like the fur trade and its sort of resonances with settler colonialism are kind of a problem that I've kind of come up against, but I haven't really thought through. And I wondered if Jonathan had thoughts about that. And the other thing I just wanted to note was the resonances between lycanthropy and vampirism are quite interesting to me, and they're both provocative analytics, and I'm curious if what it would mean to sort of further those analytics in relation to Chineseness specifically. And here again, I might think about the ways that both offer a kind of shape-shifting as a kind of methodology, but the lycanthropy seems to involve less choice, which I sort of like as a model. That is, it's kind of constructed from the outside, or there are forces beyond the individual subject that shape or compel the shifting, which I think actually is how China often gets received in the popular press in the West. That is, there are forces within itself and then beyond itself, or that it, it pushes things to such an extreme that whatever it mobilizes takes over. And I think that's an interesting way to think about China's engagement with fashion and also resources. I think China is still the largest consumer of furs in the current moment. So those are just some of my thoughts. I mean, I'm still thinking through a lot of what everyone had said. I did think a lot of the other papers also had a lot of interesting provocations, as I've been, for example, writing on South Africa. I'm not sure I have time to develop those now, but thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Sean. That is excellent. That's precisely what we want to hear in terms of respond. I know that we don't really have a lot of time, and unfortunately Simona is not around because of emergency, so she was called back to hospital. So I know that Andrew has raised quite a lot of valid points and reading into her research. So I would definitely translate back to Simona. I think that would help us to have further conversations after this session. So thank you so much. I don't think I have any question to respond with my paper, but I'm really thankful to the guest speaker who's reading into my work and also over your thoughts. And I know that I've made a mistake now in the paper that I've was putting the exhibition to open in 2023. So I have to find a way to correct it. But that's also great to know that there'll be a lot more time for the preparation, but at the same time more time for provocation, that I really watch this space for further development. So thank you all for it. And I also want to thank Elio for the response to Shin and also Anthony's paper. Anthony was with us in part 1, so he would be very delighted to hear your comments. Shin, unfortunately, she's the only one who could not join us for the launch because there's no way that we can engage with the time in Australia. So we're really sad to have missed her on this occasion, but we'll definitely translate the feedback to both of them. So I would throw the ball back to Joe and thank Joe so much for chairing this brilliant session. I learned a lot and being very busy dropping notes down. So thank you for the speaker and thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Wesley, and thank you for putting this event on. I think it's been really wonderful, and I think that we have a lot of things to go forward with. I think it's been really lovely to have people responding in such a quick way. And thank you to you, Wesley. Obviously, you have been the leader in this field for some considerable time. I know that certainly I have learned a lot from you, and I know that my journal has learned a lot from you and from your passion in this subject and your leadership. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. I'm hoping now that I think that as nobody seems to have any questions, thank you everybody. I think we should now perhaps call it a day and go and get a cup of tea or a rest or something. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks everybody.
Before we close, just very last thing. Obviously, we completely forgot to thank the audience for joining us as well. For those, especially for those who joined us for both parts, and we're really delightful to see you coming back again, and new faces also come up. So very thankful for all of you to join our session. And a little bit of publicity, and obviously the journals is not a ghost journal. I already have it at hand, so it is real, and you can find it online. But at the same time, it's in print now. So we really value your feedback. And even though today is very short and tight schedule, but we very much like to hear your feedback. Always welcome to drop us a line. So last but not least, to also thank Mariana, who's wonderfully behind the scenes orchestrating all this liaise with speakers and dealing with all these technological hiccups. So we're very grateful for these smooth run sessions. So thank you, Mariana. And I know that that's also one thing, if I don't say then I would be very much hated, is also on behalf of our research center, Creature, we have our next event coming up. So our next event will be next week, next Wednesday. And we would like to invite you to Safety in Numbers, Reclaiming Public Spaces through the work of Artichoke, a roundtable discussion exploring the work of Artichoke, which is the UK's leading producers of ambitious public art events. So we use them as a case study to envision new strategies for mass gatherings, reclaiming public spaces in light of the COVID pandemic. The event is on Wednesday next week, the 23rd of February, 5:30 to 7 p.m. UK time. You can check out the event details, and the registration link is now on Creature website. It's not led by me, but is led by our lovely colleague, Dr. Yasser Louis-Scarsel. So do join us for our Creature event and watch out further activities with the centre. So thank you all.
Thank you, Essie.